Alright, hi guys. Today we're doing a lesson on perfect squares, and specifically we'll define what a perfect square is, and we'll also figure out how to count how many perfect squares there are in a given range of numbers. So for example, one of the questions we hope to be able to answer is how many perfect squares are there between 100 and 400, inclusive. And when you see that word inclusive, first off, all that means is that it includes the numbers that are given. So if we're asked how many perfect squares are there between 100 and 400, we'll actually include the number 100 if it's a perfect square and the number 400 if it's a perfect square. But before we get to answering that question, we'll come back to this later. Let's just define a perfect square. So if you don't already know this, a perfect square is simply a number made by squaring a whole number. So for example, 25 is a perfect square, and it's a perfect square because we can square a number like 5 to get 25. So 25 is a perfect square. Another example of a perfect square is 81. The reason 81 is a perfect square is because 9 squared gives us 81. So this is the number that's a perfect square, 25, 81. Some other examples are 16 and 49. So it has to be something that can be created by squaring another number. So let's start off by listing the first 10 perfect squares. Okay, the very first one would be 1, because 1 times 1 gives us 1. The next one would be whatever 2 times 2 is. That would be the next biggest perfect square. So the first one is 1. 4. The next one is 3 squared, so 9. So you should try right now to pause this and list the first 10 perfect squares. We gave you the first 3, 1, and then 4, and then 9. Continue on with the rest. Pause this and then play it again when you're done. Okay, so here are the first 10 perfect squares. And you get this list not by imagining the perfect squares themselves, but imagining what's 1 squared, then what's 2 squared, then 3 squared, that's the next one, 4 squared, and so on. 5 squared up to 10 squared, that's when we can stop. I said just do the first 10. So the biggest one would be 100. This list will be very handy, so actually have this list written down and keep it handy so you can refer back to it for other problems later on. You really need to be quick about knowing these first 10 perfect squares. Okay, so with that being said, let's look at answering this question. How many perfect squares are there between 1 and 100? Again, that word inclusive just means we'll include 1 and we'll include 100 if they're perfect squares. So we just answered that basically because we just made a list of all the perfect squares between 1 and 100. The first 10 start at 1 and end at 100. So we actually already know this answer. There are 10 perfect squares between 1 and 100. We start with 1 squared, go up 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 10 squared. So that's the answer to that, 10. You're not going to always have to list them when we're doing these. We just need to know how many of them there are sometimes. So that one was a little easier because we could actually list them out. Let's look at the original problem we talked about and see how we could figure out how many perfect squares are there between 100 and 400 without having to list them. Or if we do list them, we don't want to actually solve them, find them. We'll list them in a different way. Okay, your hint for this is to find the first and the last perfect square that's in this set. The smallest and the biggest perfect square. So we're doing 100 to 400 and we're including it. First thing to check for, is 100 a perfect square? And in this case, yes it is. So 100 actually ends up being our smallest square. So that right there is the first. Then, and we get that by doing 10 squared, so I'm going to jot that down as well. The last one, we can check to see, is 400 a perfect square? Okay, if you don't already know this, you should know that 400 is a perfect square because 20 times 20 gives us 400. When you're multiplying multiples of 10, you can just multiply the 2's together and then tack on these 2 extra zeros. So 20 times 20 is 400. 400 actually is a perfect square. That actually makes things a little bit easier. And we get 400 by doing 20 squared. So that doesn't answer the question, how many perfect squares are there? We need to figure out how many there are. I don't want to actually find all of the perfect squares in between 100 and 400. Instead, if I know that 10 squared is my first one, well then I know 11 squared is also going to be in this group. So is 12 squared. I don't have to get those numbers, but I do need to understand that if 10 squared is the smallest and 20 squared is the biggest, all the ones in between will also be included. And you'll actually be able to count them up in this case. You won't always be able to do that, but in this case you can actually count them up. Now the mistake a lot of people make is they just say, okay, well, we're going between 10 and 20, so there must be 10 of them, 10 perfect squares between 10 and 20. They just subtract. But that's actually not the case. If you actually count them, starting with 10, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 perfect squares. And that's because it's inclusive. Because we're including both of the 10 squared and the 20 squared, you can't just subtract them. When you get into numbers bigger that you can't list, you can subtract them. But then, because that doesn't include both numbers, you got to remember to just add 1 to that answer. So we can't just subtract the 20 minus 10 to figure out how many are between 10 squared and 20 squared. You have to add 1 to that if you're going to do it that way. So the answer here is 11 numbers. You don't have to list them. You don't have to know what they are. You just need to know that they start at 10 squared, they end at 20 squared. So I have 11 numbers in total that are perfect squares between 100 and 400. Okay, let's do one more example like that. Okay, let's see how many perfect squares there are between 400 and 1,000 inclusively. Okay, we already know 400 is a perfect square, so that's good. We're going to include that and it's going to start us off, and that's 20 squared. We need to know how, that's the first one. We need to know how high to go up to. So we need to know what the last one is, and it might take some guessing and checking here. 1,000 is not a perfect square. Okay, if you're not comfortable with some of these big number multiplication problems, look, what you need to understand is that some basic ones. 10 times 10 is 100. That's how we're going to start trying to figure out how can we get close to 1,000. We need to get as close as we can to 1,000 without going too far over it. So we know we need something bigger than 10. In fact, we know we need something bigger than 20 because that's 400. So what we're trying to do is figure out the biggest perfect square that would be in this group. So we need a perfect square that's close to 1,000. As close as possible, but still under, not over. So then keep doing whole numbers like this that are easy to work with, because we can do this in our head. We can do some mental math. 30 times 30 is 900, and that gets us really close to 1,000. But I can't just say, okay, that's my biggest one. I have to actually check. We can go with 40 times 40, but you should know that 40 times 40 is actually a 16 with 2 zeros, so that's way too big. So we have to get really close to 900. We're really close with this. So 30 times 30, 30 squared is close to the last one, but it might not actually be it. So now we have to start guessing and checking with that we probably can't multiply in our head. Let's try 31. Since 40 was way too big, 30 is really close. It's somewhere in between, and it's probably very close to 30. This is where you'll have to actually do some math on the side on your own. So actually multiply 31 times 30. Don't cheat, don't use a calculator. You won't be able to necessarily use a calculator when you do these. So we'll multiply this out. It doesn't take that long. That gets us 961. That's even closer. Okay, there's still no guarantee that that's the biggest one. It's pretty close. I'm going to try 32 next and see if that gets me even closer or if it goes over. So we'll see, does 32 squared give us a perfect square? Still under 1,000. So I'll multiply these together. And it goes over 1,000. It's 1,024. So we can't go over, so that means we can't use 32. What that tells me is that my biggest perfect square that doesn't go over 1,000 is 961, and I get that by doing 31 squared. So now the question is, how many of them are there? We've got the first and we've got the last. We know 20 squared is the smallest, 31 squared is the biggest. I'm not going to list all these out this time, but just to get it going, we know that if 20 squared's the smallest, 21 squared, whatever that may be, is also in here as a perfect square. Whatever 22 squared is, whatever 23 squared is, all of those up until 31 squared are perfect squares that fall between 400 and 1,000. We just need to know how many are there between 20 and 31, and that's where we use that trick that we just talked about. You can subtract them, but it's not good enough just to subtract them. When you subtract them, you get 11. Don't forget that you have to actually add 1 to that answer, because that way we include the 400, the first and the last, the 20 squared and the 31 squared. So your actual answer here is there are 12 numbers. You could list them out, but this is the shortcut way to do it. Subtract the numbers and add 1, including both the 20 and the 31 squared. So here, the answer to how many perfect squares are there between 400 and 1,000? The answer is 12.